Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. So according to recent surveys, over 80% of people in the US and the UK believe in miracles. And I think that's very astonishing because now we rely on all sorts of scientific technology like smartphones and computers and other scientific tools. So why do we still believe in miracles? So first of all, I'd like to find out why we still believe in miracles and whether it is rational to believe in miracles. So let me start with some examples. So this woman was making a toasted cheese sandwich. And then she realized that there was a burn pattern on a slice of a toast, which looked, according to her, just like the Virgin Mary. And she thought that this was a miracle, so she kept it in a plastic container for more than 10 years. And meanwhile, she won a lot of money at the casino, so she thought that this is a miraculous object. But for some reason, she decided to sell it on eBay, and she managed to earn $28,000, which is probably more miraculous than this object itself. Should we say that this is a miracle? And I think the answer is no, because this is just a coincidence. Given that millions of slices of toast are made around the world, it's not a surprise that occasionally we see this kind of strange pattern. What about this case? This is another example of a coincidence. So in 1950, there was a massive explosion at the local church in Nebraska. And when the explosion took place, everyone thought that a lot of people were killed because they were supposed to have a meeting of the church choir. But surprisingly, every single member had a trivial reason to be late for the meeting, only on that day. So these members are always very punctual, but only on this day, everyone had a trivial reason to be late for the meeting. So for example, one of them was on the phone and she just forgot about the meeting. Another one was listening to the radio and she couldn't turn it off. Another one was writing an important letter and she forgot about the meeting as well. So they had all sorts of silly reasons to be late for the meeting. And then there was this massive explosion. And of course, they thought that this is a miracle because no one was hurt. So they thought that God saved them from this explosion. But I would still say that this is not exactly a miracle, at least in a philosophical sense. Because given that there are billions of people on this planet doing all sorts of things every day, occasionally we encounter this kind of unusual coincidence. But it's difficult for us to say that this is a miracle in a philosophical or theological sense. So here I would like to introduce 3 different types of impossibility. So certain events are probabilistically impossible. So these coincidences are probabilistically impossible or unlikely. But these events can take place unless the probability of these events taking place is exactly 0. So again, given that there are so many people around the world doing so many different things, occasionally these probabilistically unlikely or impossible events can take place. So I think miracles cannot be probabilistically impossible. Miracles have to involve some kind of impossibility, but it cannot be a probabilistic impossibility. It has to be something stronger than probabilistic impossibility. So what about logical impossibility? So certain acts are logically impossible to perform. So for example, it is logically impossible to draw a square circle or create a married bachelor or make 1 + 1 5. So they are logically impossible tasks. So it is necessarily impossible to perform these tasks. Now, I think this is a little bit too strong. We cannot say that miracles are logically impossible tasks because miracles are supposed to happen. But if it is necessarily impossible as a matter of logic to perform these tasks, then they cannot be performed. So even theistic philosophers often claim that God cannot perform logically impossible tasks, because these logically impossible tasks are not real tasks. They sound like tasks, but actually no one can perform it in any possible situation. So that means that they are not authentic tasks. So what we need is something between probabilistic impossibility and logical impossibility. So my suggestion is that miracles are nomologically impossible events, which means that miracles cannot take place given the laws of nature. So our universe is governed by the laws of nature, and when they are violated, these miracle workers can perform miracles. So this is a typical philosophical definition of a miracle. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature that is caused by an intentional agent, and it has religious significance. So a miracle has to be caused by some agent, like God or an angel, who have free will and intention. And also, they have to have some religious significance. So normally, miracles have positive outcomes. It'd be a little bit odd to say a miracle has taken place, but it's really bad. So normally, miracles have some positive impact. And most importantly, miracles have to violate the laws of nature. So this is the key feature of miracles. So if you look at many examples in religious scriptures, then you can see that they all violate the laws of nature. So for example, Jesus is reported to have resurrected Lazarus, who had been dead for several days. And we cannot resurrect someone who had been dead for many days without violating the laws of nature. Or Jesus is reported to have walked on water or transformed water into wine, and they all require violations of the laws of nature. And miracles are also reported in religious scriptures in the East. So for example, the Buddha, when he was born, he immediately walked seven steps north, and then he said, "I'm chief of the world." And again, without violating the laws of nature, it is impossible for a newborn baby to walk and speak like this. So that's why we can say that this is a miracle. Now, there are many different types of miracles. So there are so many, but I'd like to introduce some of them. Producing substances. So for instance, Muhammad is believed to have filled an empty well or filled an empty bag of barley for a hungry man. Controlling weather. So Jesus, according to the New Testament, Jesus rebuked a fierce rainstorm on the Sea of Galilee. Controlling the sun and the moon. Muhammad, for example, is believed to have changed the movement of the sun or split the moon in two. Controlling geographical features. So according to the Old Testament, in response to Moses' request, God parted the Red Sea so that Moses and his people can escape from the Egyptian army. Teleportation and bilocation. So, many Hindu saints and gurus are reported to have appeared in two places at the same time or teleported from one location to another instantly. Transfiguration. According to the New Testament, Jesus transfigured himself on a mountain. So he suddenly became a very strong light, which is understood to represent his heavenly glory. Stigmata is well known in the Catholic tradition. So this includes all sorts of scars that appear on people's bodies that correspond to the wounds that Jesus had. So this is a symbolic miracle. Healing is also very widely reported in almost in all religious traditions. So Jesus, Muhammad, and the Buddha, and so on, all of these leaders of the world's great religion are believed to have healed sick people, often instantly. Raising the dead, so as I mentioned, Jesus is believed to have resurrected dead people, and there are similar episodes in the Old Testament as well. Supernatural perception includes precognition, retrocognition, and mind reading. So these miracle workers, they can predict what will happen in future exactly, or they can immediately grasp what happened in the past, or they can read people's minds accurately. Controlling immaterial spirits. Probably the best example is exorcism. So exorcism is a religious practice to evict an evil spirit that is possessing a human. So if you remember the film The Exorcist, the priest tries to evict an evil spirit from a girl. Spiritual communication includes all sorts of ways for a supernatural beings to communicate with people. So sometimes these beings appear in dreams, and sometimes they appear in religious experiences, and sometimes they appear as apparitions, as ghosts. Now, what I find very interesting is that many of these leaders of the world's great religions, like Jesus, the Buddha, Muhammad, and so on, they are reported to have performed miracles themselves, but at the same time, they are not particularly enthusiastic about miracles. So they warn against dependence on miracles, which I find very puzzling. So for example, the Buddha met a yogi one day who was trying to walk on water for several years. And then the Buddha said that, why do you do this? This is just a waste of time, because you can just take a ferry for a small change to go to the other side of the river. So you're just wasting your time. Or in the New Testament, Jesus was challenged by the devil, and the devil says that you have to turn rocks into bread, or jump off from a high temple without getting hurt. And then Jesus simply refused. I mean, if Jesus was a miracle worker, then of course he could have performed these miracles, but he simply refused, which is quite interesting and also puzzling. But I'd like to come back to this point a little bit later. So as I said earlier, according to recent surveys, many people, the majority of people, still believe in miracles. And I'd like to explain why. Because, again, we rely on scientific knowledge and technology, but still we believe in something beyond science. And why is that? My hypothesis is that there are some psychological reasons that people tend to form belief in miracles. So there are some cognitive and developmental reasons that people form belief in miracles. So let me introduce some psychological studies that are relevant here. So according to some developmental psychologists, even infants can detect violations of the laws of nature. So again, miracles have to involve violations of the laws of nature. This means that in order to detect a miracle, first of all, you have to know what the laws of nature are, how nature is operated according to the laws, and also you have to be able to grasp it immediately when they are violated. And this sounds like a very sophisticated cognitive process, but according to some psychologists, even 2.5-month-old babies can detect violations of the laws of nature. So for example, they show a toy lion to children, babies, that appear to vanish suddenly, or a toy car that appears to hover in the air. And then these babies, they express surprise. And sometimes they bang these toys to see how that could happen. Or sometimes they try to duplicate these violations of the laws of nature. So this suggests that they have innate knowledge of the laws of nature, and when they are violated, they can immediately grasp it. So it looks like we have this natural tendency to see violations of nature, violations of the laws of nature. Sorry. And these developmental psychologists, they say that this element of surprise is very important for children's learning process. Another relevant psychological study here is a detection of agents' faces and voices. So some psychologists claim that we are good at scanning the environment, our environment, and then find agency there. So a relevant concept here is the hyperactive agency detection device. So this is a cognitive device. It's not a material device, but it's a cognitive device that everyone has. So when we see the clouds in the sky, we might see strange faces or animals. And that's because we all have the hyperactive agency detection device. So we are good at finding agency in nature. So here's an example. So this is the face on Mars. This is a geological structure on Mars, which appears to be a face. It's very difficult for us not to see a face, even though this structure looks quite different from different angles. And sometimes this kind of phenomenon is called pareidolia, which is a psychological phenomenon where we see something meaningful in random information. According to psychologists, we also detect the intention of agents in nature. So if you ask small children why rocks are pointy or why the sunlight is warm, they tend to provide teleological explanations. They tend to explain these natural phenomena in terms of purpose. So they might say, rocks are pointy so that birds cannot sit down on them. Or the sunlight is warm so that it can warm up animals, and so on. So they appeal to purpose when they try to explain natural phenomena. And adults have this kind of tendency as well. So maybe that's why when we encounter unusual events, we might intuitively think that this is caused by God or some supernatural being with intention. Children are also good at detecting supernatural beings. So they tend to attribute supernatural properties to humans as well. So the Swiss psychologist John Piaget, he interviewed many children, and he discovered that they tend to attribute these unusual supernatural properties to adults. So for example, he talks about a girl who asked her aunt to make it rain, or a boy who was puzzled when his father didn't know something. So children tend to attribute the properties of omniscience or omnipotence to adults. Maybe that's another indirect reason that people, and especially children, tend to see something supernatural in nature. Minimally counterintuitive concepts. This is also relevant to this psychological work related to supernatural beliefs. According to some psychologists, well-known miracle stories, they involve so-called minimally counterintuitive concepts. So these are concepts that are somewhat surprising and counterintuitive and contradictory, but they are not overly contradictory. And these concepts spread very well because it's very easy to remember these stories because they have some counterintuitive elements. But at the same time, they are not difficult to remember because these stories are pretty straightforward, only minimally counterintuitive. So here's an example. So about 100 years ago, there was a girl called Okiku in Hokkaido, Japan. And one day, her father bought her this little doll. And Okiku loved the doll very much, and she played with it every day and slept with it every night. But sadly, Okiku passed away after a couple of years. And after her death, people realized that the hair of the doll had grown And they thought that this is because Okiku loved the doll so much that her spirit possessed this doll. That's why the hair had grown. And this is a good example of a minimally counterintuitive concept. The whole story is pretty straightforward and easy to remember, but at the same time there's one catchy counterintuitive element, which is the growing hair of the doll. And according to psychologists, stories like this spread very well, and they last for a long time over many generations. And if you see many miracle episodes in religious scriptures, such as Jesus turning water into wine, or walking on water, or resurrecting the dead, they all involve minimally counterintuitive concepts. So we have seen various psychological studies that seem to suggest that we are cognitively biased towards forming belief in miracles. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always irrational to believe in miracles. Or miracles can never take place. So for example, suppose that, here's a parallel example. So suppose that psychologists discover that I tend to see an illusion of a can of beer in my fridge when I'm very thirsty. Now I go home and open my fridge and I see a can of beer. And does that mean that I'm seeing an illusion? I mean, that's not so obvious. Maybe I bought a can of beer last night and that's why it's there. So even if we have this natural tendency to form belief in miracles, that doesn't necessarily mean that miracles can never take place, or every time when we encounter miracles, they are illusions. That's why I'd like to address this question next. Is it rational to believe in miracles? Carl Sagan was an American astronomer and science fiction writer, and he introduced this famous slogan: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So he says that in order to establish something extraordinary, you have to have extraordinary evidence. So suppose that my friend says that he saw a fox in his garden last night. Now I know that this friend is very trustworthy and he almost never lies. And also I know that foxes had been observed in his village. And I had pretty good reason to believe that he has actually seen a fox in his garden. But suppose instead he says that he saw a Martian in his garden last night. Can we believe that on the basis of similar evidence? No, because now his new claim is extraordinary. He says that he saw a Martian. That's an extraordinary claim, so we need extraordinary evidence to believe him. David Hume is a Scottish philosopher, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, and he appealed to a similar reasoning to show that it is always unreasonable to believe in miracles, or we can never be justified in believing in miracles. So here is a summary of his argument. So he says, okay, gather as much evidence as possible for a miracle. It can never be strong enough to establish your belief because evidence against a miracle is always much, much bigger. Because again, according to our definition, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, which means that any evidence against a miracle includes the entire laws of nature. But there is nothing more certain than the laws of nature, because the laws of nature are based on constant observations of how nature operates. So no matter how much evidence we gather for a miracle, that's never strong enough to establish our belief in miracles. So that's Hume's argument. So he says that it is always unreasonable to believe in miracles, or it is, we can never be justified in believing in miracles. But again, I want to emphasize that this does not necessarily mean that miracles can never take place. All he says is that even if a miracle can take place, there is no situation in which we are justified in believing that it has taken place. So at this point, I would like to consider if there can be a miracle that doesn't involve a violation of the laws of nature. So I want to focus on what I call extremely altruistic act. An extremely altruistic act is an act to sacrifice one's own life to save a stranger's life. So let me introduce some examples. So in 1982, Florida Air Flight 90 took off from Washington National Airport. And the weather was really terrible. There was a snowstorm. And then the aircraft couldn't gain altitude, and it smashed into a frozen river there. And most of the passengers were killed, and only a very small number of them survived. And a rescue helicopter came, and they threw a life ring. And you can find a footage of this incident on the web, and it's really heartbreaking. It's very difficult to rescue them because they are so cold that they even struggle to grab the life ring. And at one point, a bystander jumped into the frozen river to rescue one of the passengers. And that's also an act of altruism. And then one of the passengers who survived was Arland D. Williams, Jr., and every time a life ring was thrown, he grabbed it and then handed it to a different passenger instead of using it for himself. And eventually, these passengers were rescued. And then the helicopter went back to rescue finally Williams, but he was already gone. So this is an act of what I call extreme altruism, because this is an act to prioritize other people's lives, strangers' lives, and sacrifice one's own life. Here's another example. Maximilian Kolbe was a Polish priest in the first half of the 20th century. He was sent to the Auschwitz death camp, and one day another prisoner was selected to be sent to a starvation bunker. And he cried and screamed, saying, I have a wife and a child, and I cannot die. I don't want to be sent to a starvation bunker. And then Koba came in, and he said, I'd like to replace this man. I would like to substitute him because I'm a priest and I don't have a family. So send me instead of him to the starvation bunker. And he survived in the starvation bunker for a long time, but eventually he was killed there. And this is another example of an extremely altruistic act. And I talk about extremely altruistic acts because they are not exactly miracles, but they do something similar to that. Extremely altruistic acts evoke awe and surprise because they violate, through the altruistic person's own willpower, a strong behavioral trait that humans have acquired through the long process of evolution. So these acts don't violate the laws of nature, but they still violate our behavioral trait to prioritize our own survival. So we have developed this kind of trait through the long process of evolution and natural selection. So our biological interest should be to survive and propagate our own genes. But these altruists, they sacrifice their own survival and to save others. So there is something contradictory. It's not exactly a violation of the laws of nature, but something comparable to that. Now, there are many scientific theories to explain away altruism. So there are animals that act altruistically, and biologists try to explain how that could happen. So for example, group selection theory says that natural selection can take place at the level of a group instead of individuals. Or kin selection theory says that sometimes it is genetically beneficial to act altruistically towards genetically related individuals. Or reciprocation theory says that some animals, even if they are in different species, they act altruistically because these altruistic acts are mutually beneficial and so on. But none of these theories can explain away extremely altruistic acts because these acts are one-off events where there is no evolutionary or genetic advantage for the altruists. Shusaku Endo was a Japanese Christian author, and he wrote a novel called Silence. And Martin Scorsese made a film based on this novel recently. And Endo talks about Koba, and I think his remark is quite interesting and relevant here. So he says, "I would not think of it as a miracle if bread had suddenly fallen from heaven, or lights from heaven had blinded the Nazi officials when the priest was sent to a starvation bunker. What is important is the fact that to save the crying young man in front of him, Koba said without a sense of despair, 'I don't have a wife or a child, as I'm a priest. Let me substitute him,' and voluntarily went to the starvation bunker only to die. I want to say that this fact is a miracle." So Endo is not a philosopher, so he doesn't know the philosophical definition of a miracle. But what he says is this. So Koba couldn't violate the laws of nature because he was an ordinary human. But because of that, he acted altruistically. So if he had a supernatural power, then maybe he could have just produced food in the starvation bunker, or he could have just killed the Nazi officials to save other prisoners. But he couldn't do that. And because he couldn't do that, he sacrificed his own life to save a stranger's life. And that is what's remarkable about his act. So somewhat paradoxically, Koba's act is religiously significant because he couldn't violate the laws of nature, because he wasn't a supernatural being who can go beyond the laws of nature. So extremely altruistic acts could be considered as miraculous as, or possibly even more so than what we have defined as miracles, because they do not violate the laws of nature. So Hume's argument against the reasonableness of believing in miracles, and that's based on the idea that miracles always violate the laws of nature. But extremely altruistic acts are not vulnerable to Hume's argument because they don't violate the laws of nature. Now, earlier I said that the leaders of the world's great religions, they warn against dependence on miracles. So they are not very enthusiastic about people trying to perform miracles. And I think now the reason is pretty clear. Violating the laws of nature is impressive, but it does not in itself make one's act worthwhile. So it's very easy to impress people by violating the laws of nature, because they're like magic. It's very easy to impress people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your act is meaningful because you violate the laws of nature. There are many other acts, such as Koba's and Williams's, that do not violate the laws of nature, but they do something comparable to that, and these acts are more worthwhile. So I think these religious leaders, they wanted people to focus on these worthwhile acts, and they didn't want to focus on this unique feature of a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Yujin. We've got a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions, let's ask. But give me a second to get to you with the mic. I will start. I have a question. Do you think it's possible to predict when miracles might be perceived? So when people are in a particular state of credulousness or their circumstances such they might want to see miracles?
So when people want to see miracles,
Yeah.
are you suggesting that they tend to see miracles because they expect for a miracle to happen? Yeah, I think that kind of bias can play an important role in people's formation of belief in miracles. So, yes, according to psychology, people tend to have certain expectations, such as confirmation bias. So, suppose that I say that, these days a lot of people wear red shirts, and then you tend to confirm a lot of examples, right? Because now you focus on people wearing a red shirt. And then you think, oh, actually, your hypothesis is right. Everyone wears a red shirt now. And that's an example of a cognitive bias. And I think that kind of thing can happen when people form a belief in miracle as well.
I was just wondering, do you think there's any difficulty around labeling somebody else's act as being an altruistic act without being privy to the kind of the inside of that person's head? I guess there could be any reason why they decide to perform this action that objectively is altruistic.
Right. Altruism is a very tricky notion because whatever altruists do, you can always provide an ad hoc explanation why they perform in that way. So in the case of Koba, for example, you could say that he just wanted to sacrifice his life to be, so that he can go to heaven, or he had some interest to act out altruistically. So he's not a genuine altruist. So I think for any altruistic act, we can always provide an ad hoc explanation. So it's very difficult to establish, unless you act altruistically, it's very difficult to show that people's acts are truly altruistic. So some people say that the notion of altruism itself is somehow self-contradictory. And I think it's true that Koba, in one sense, he wanted to sacrifice his life. So in a way, his wish was granted, but that doesn't really undermine his altruistic intention, because it's not as if he wanted to sacrifice himself because that's pleasurable for him or anything like that. I think he wanted to sacrifice his life so that the other prisoner would be saved. So I think we could still say that his act was altruistic. But as you suggested, unless you can see the inside of his head, it's quite difficult to say what kind of exact intention he had.
You said at the beginning of the lecture that about 80% of people in this country believe in miracles, but I think only about 49% of people believe in God. So do you think that says anything interesting about whatever it is, the 30-odd% of people that don't believe in any divine agency but do believe in miracles?
Yeah, that's a good question. So often belief in miracles is more widespread than belief in God. But normally we assume that only religious people believe in miracles. And I think maybe one of the reasons is that the concept of a miracle is not defined precisely. So these surveys, when they ask people if they believe in miracles, they don't provide a specific definition of a miracle. So sometimes people have in mind some unusual coincidences or some amazing events. So they might not necessarily have in mind a violation of the laws of nature that can be only performed by God or some supernatural beings. So I think maybe one of the reasons is that the term miracle can be quite vague. So I think if you want to conduct a survey, I think it's quite important to specify exactly what you mean by a miracle.
Any more questions?
I'm interested to know if the incidence of miracles is declining, or has it remained static, and if there are any kind of more recent examples which you've looked at and have you stumped?
Yes, according to one survey that I read, actually younger people believe in miracles more than older people. And many of them claim that they know someone who has experienced a miracle, which I find quite surprising because if you are old, then you have more time to experience miracle. But actually, younger people they believe in miracles more than older people. And if you look at newspapers and magazines, there are a lot of examples of miracles, but often they are just coincidences or some unexpected events. Even in sports, people talk about miracles, and they are not miracles in a religious sense. And these days, we don't really see amazing religious miracles that are reported in the religious scriptures, but maybe they are still taking place somewhere and we just don't know about them.
It's more of an observation, really. I'll probably make more sense after I've read the book, but I think we've almost lost the vocabulary for looking into and expressing anything that's a little bit strange. So outside the remit of faith or logic or whatever, if weird things happen to you, it's probably best not to talk about them. And I think maybe we've kind of lost that collectively, Virgin Mary on toast aside. So I'm looking forward to reading this.
Yeah, so many people who have religious experiences, they tend not to tell about it to anyone. They tend to be quite reserved about their experiences, which is quite interesting. Because when you have a strange experience, normally you would want to tell someone. But when it comes to religious or mystical experiences, they tend to keep them secret, which is quite interesting.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to go into any detail, but I mean, in my case, it's just a bit, I feel like it's a bit weird and embarrassing. So that's probably why, I'm sure.
Oh, okay. So do you think that if you experience a miracle, you might think that, oh, this is a little bit crazy, and
I wouldn't
if
say
you,
it was a miracle, but I think that's probably how people feel. I mean, if it's something strange and inexplicable, and if you consider yourself to be a very rational person, something strange happens.
How do you feel that you wouldn't be believed? So like people consider you like, that's a bit weird kind of consideration.
yeah. So miracles are by definition weird events, and if you experience something really, really weird, actually you might not want to tell anyone because it's so strange, and you don't want people to think that you're crazy.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So you mentioned earlier that young people would be more inclined to believe in miracles, and it actually is an easier way to explain things to them. Or so is that a good thing, or should we? How do we strike the balance between explaining things with miracles, and then versus explaining rational thing? Like, yeah, it's mentioned the ant could make rain happen. So how do we strike the balance between, right, tell them, oh yeah, actually someone decides to make rain, or we say, actually no, this is how it works, this is how the weather works.
Okay, so when I said that the belief in miracles is more common among young people, I didn't mean small children, I meant young adults. Yeah, obviously if you ask children, probably many of them believe in what we call a miracle, because according to some cognitive scientists, children naturally form religious beliefs. So they even say that if you put a group of children on a remote island, they all start their own religion. They form religious beliefs naturally because there are some cognitive and evolutionary reasons to form these beliefs. But the survey that I read was about young adults, and then they seem to believe in miracles more than older people, which I find quite puzzling, I think. But you could say that young people, maybe they haven't had a lot of experience in life, so maybe when they encounter unusual events, they just attribute it to something beyond nature.
Hi, thanks. So you talked about how there's religious significance for the miracle. So I presume with most known religions, there's some sort of governing group that observe evidence, or at least the stories behind miracles, and then decides as a collective group whether that's a miracle or not. I presume that's a common function of every religion, and I'd love to know if not. And are there sort of common behaviours within these groups that observe the evidence and decide whether they're miracles or not? Are there sometimes interesting divergence in approaches?
Yeah, so obviously miracles are very important in Christianity because Jesus' birth was miraculous, and after his death there was the resurrection, which is a very important part of Christianity. And in the Catholic tradition there is a very rigorous process of proving whether or not miracles have taken place. And that's important for the process of canonization. So Mother Teresa was canonized a couple of years ago, and that was based on her posthumous miracles that she allegedly performed. So she cured a Brazilian man who had brain tumors, and another person. I forgot what kind of condition she had, but obviously, arguably, she cured 2 people and healed 2 people, and on the basis of these miracles, she was canonized. So in the Catholic tradition, especially, miracles are very important. But my impression is that in the Eastern tradition, Buddhism and Hinduism and so on, miracles are not that important, at least not as important as in Christianity.
Any more questions? Thank you very much, Yujin. That was very interesting.
Thank you.